Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today to our HRG Humanities Week Research Outreach session on podcasts as research dissemination with Lori Beckstead. We're really excited to have Lori here. And this whole week is about different ways to engage and disseminate research. And this is a really important one as more and more people become interested in podcasting, more and more people apply for funding to do podcasts. Lori's a co-author of just an excellent book, and I'm going to show it to you, Podcast or Perish, which is, such a great term. And we'll get into the book. We'll talk about it, but the book's great. It lays out a really salient argument that I think academics need to engage, whether or not they want to do podcasts. It's really relevant in terms of looking at where academia is and how do we do peer review, and also it makes me think about how anytime there's a new medium, there's always a backlash to it. It's going to ruin civilization. And that goes back to Plato and his concerns about writing and that we wouldn't be able to memorize things anymore. And I mean, he's right that can happen. But of course, we wouldn't really know about Plato now if it weren't for writing. Similarly, the printing press, people get really upset about it. And indeed, there were very terrible books. One of the most popular books that came out after the printing press in 1486 was about, it caused a whole bunch of witch trials and witch burnings. So, of course, a medium is going to produce all sorts of different kinds of things. But as we know, we're very attached to books now. And that is the mainstay of academia. And so what Lori's work is about, and what we're going to talk about today is not being a fuddy-duddies and not waiting for a generation or two from now to grasp onto this new media when it's, gotten respect, and sort of being quicker to grasp onto it and to use it in the ways that it is useful to academia. So Lori Beckstead is an associate professor of media production at TMU, and she is the co-author of Podcast or Perish. And I just wanted to start by welcoming you, Lori, and if you could tell us a little bit more about your background and what brings you into this topic.
Sure. Thank you so much, Kim. I'm delighted that you invited me to talk about this. I'm super excited to delve into this with you and with those present. So I have been a professor, an associate professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson University, for over 20 years now. And I came to it sort of through media production. So I have a background in radio broadcasting and journalism, and I don't have a PhD. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I come to the whole idea of academic publishing and how do we create knowledge and how do we disseminate it. It was always a little bit inscrutable to me, and it also was very apparent that it was quite gate kept. And this is how things are done, and this is the only way things are done, and kind of get on board or perish, right? So I've always been interested in alternate ways of creating knowledge and disseminating it in particular. So I've engaged in projects where I've crowdsourced data. I have done research, in fact, quantitative research, where I've used that data I presented the data through a hacked radio. So the research was about how many hosts on air on Toronto radio stations represent diverse communities. And I hacked a radio so you could physically turn the knobs on it to a certain station and find out how many women were on air, how many men, how many racialized people, et cetera. And it would interact with you depending on the data. So, and these are the kinds of things that never really got any kind of, the response to me was generally, pat, that's nice, Lori. Make sure you write a journal article about it. So that always just seemed a little bit like, really? Are you serious? But anyway, so that's where we find ourselves, but I'm happy to be able to talk about how podcasting can help maybe even subvert some of these traditions.
Yes, we're definitely going to be talking about the snootiness factor of academia and how, academia sort of shoots itself in the foot because you're not making an argument in this book that the book is dead and text is, it's more, let's open things up and, not ignore the positives of this new medium, right?
Exactly. Let's be more inclusive and accessible in how we create and disseminate knowledge and who we think of as peers. And it's, yeah.
Exactly. And what we'll also get to the public aspect, which I'm really interested to dig into, because again, that goes back to this idea that, you want to do something very particular in a peer-reviewed journal, and how many people are going to read that versus also taking that research and making it more accessible publicly. And interestingly, as we're all in Canada working in public universities, I think that's something we should think about more.
Mhm.
And also if you respect academia and think it's important. So, all right. So first of all, could you just tell us a little bit more about the book? So the Bloomsbury has a whole series of books on podcasts, right? If you could just tell us about how you got involved in the book, and how you got to work with the co-authors, just how it evolved.
Yeah, sure. It was a pandemic baby, basically, this book. I found that during the pandemic, I started connecting more with colleagues overseas and, beyond my institution and beyond sort of my usual circle or bubble, if you will. And so there was a group called the Pod Academics, which became quite active over the pandemic lockdowns, where we would just set up meetings and chat with each other about our research. And that's where I met Ian M. Cook, my co-author, and Hannah McGregor. Ian is an anthropologist, and he was writing a book at the time. Uh, it's Here it is: Scholarly Podcasting. Why,
Mhm.
what, how? And this may be the first book, I think, that really looked at scholarly podcasting. So he was interviewing scholars who podcast about their experience, why they did it, that sort of thing. So I was invited to an interview with him. He's a great fellow. And Hannah McGregor, the two of them are the smartest, funniest people I have ever met.
Mhm.
And all of us had a sort of foot in of interest in terms of what is scholarly podcasting and how can we use it in the peer review process. All three of us were dabbling in that. Hannah had done what may have been the first peer review podcast series, Secret Feminist Agenda. So this was in collaboration with Wilfrid Laurier University Press, and Hannah put out a couple of seasons of this podcast. After the first season, it was uh, reviewers were invited to review the podcast as a series and give feedback, and which was incorporated into the second season. And so that may have been one of the first sort of examples of peer reviewing a podcast. So I invited them both to be part of this book, and it turned out we just had similar politics, similar senses of humor, which I think readers will find in this book. I had to reread the book before doing this presentation, just because it's like, what did we write again? It's been a
Mhm.
while. So I refreshed my memory, and I was actually finding myself laughing out loud at our own writing and remembering the collaboration that we had in writing this book. So I feel like the book, even though it is a traditional academic output, it came together through collaborative talking. We had writing sessions together over Zoom. We did a lot of talking. There's a lot of transcriptions of some of our conversations in here. Yeah, so it was a really, really fun project.
Can you tell us a little bit more? So, with Hannah's podcast being peer reviewed, so she's recording the series, and then when it's done, like, has it been published and she sends it out for peer review? Can you tell us a little bit more about what that peer review process looked like?
Sure. So it was published as any podcast would be. So, she put out the first episode, followed by the next and the next until the season was over. And then peers were invited by Wilfrid Laurier University Press to review the season. And they were given questions that were what I would call media adaptive. So, in other words, it was all the usual questions about peer review, the strength of the arguments and that sort of thing. But also because this was a podcast, and Hannah wasn't just reading an academic paper on each recording. She was talking to people. It was sort of through the lens of critical feminism, and so the questions that the reviewers were given were adapted to this medium. because podcasting, there's an expectation that it's a certain way, that it's conversational, et cetera. And it's in many ways really different from what the expectations are of traditional scholarly publishing. So there were certain questions that looked to address that. And the reviewers, their reviews were made public. So there was sort of an accountability towards each other, and the reviews were then incorporated into the second season. Yeah, so I think that's my understanding of how that went.
And in hers, it's so you said it's based mostly around an interview model, is that right?
Yeah, chatting interview. I think she had some solo casts as part of the episodes, um, you know, reflecting on an interview that she had done with someone. Then there'd be sort of a reflection, and that's one of the things that podcasting really does invite, is this kind of reflection on the work, because it's a serialized medium, that there's always an opportunity to kind of reflect back and be accountable to listeners or anyone else who may have commented or given input into what they heard on the last episode or before.
Hmm.
Yeah, so
So can you explain for us what is the sort of parameters of what makes a scholarly podcast?
yeah, we really had to grapple with this in the book.
Hmm.
And funnily enough, when we first sent out our book for review, and we did some alternate peer review styles. So, for example, we sent out the first chapter. Well, we made it public as a Google document, and then invited everybody we knew who had anything to do with podcast studies to read it and comment on it, and even have conversations with each other in the comments. And one of the comments was, okay, so you keep talking about scholarly podcasting, but you haven't actually explained what you mean by it. And we're like,
Hmm.
right, pretty critical thing to do. So we did grapple a lot with this. But anyhow, our definition, let me just double check my notes so I get this right. Um, it's a podcast that has the potential to be reviewed, number one. So in other words, it doesn't necessarily have to have been reviewed or be reviewed, but it structures itself as if podcasts produce themselves. The scholar produces the podcast in such a way that they are aware that reviewers, experts, and others may be able to review this, and so it's kind of put together in that way. Secondly, it's that the knowledge within that podcast can be interrogated, it can be cited, and even in some cases it might be able to be reproduced depending on the field that it's in. And the third thing that defines scholarly podcasting in our definition is that the podcast can respond to comments and feedback and criticism and other input. And it can do that either prior to its publication, depending how you set it up, or as part of the ongoing production of the podcast, or even by other means such as social media, a related ecosystem of participation around the podcast. So it has to know that it can be reviewed. It needs to be able to be interrogated, cited, and sometimes reproduced, and that it can respond to input.
So it's got to contain some element of like some sort of argument or thesis that could be disagreed with, that those kinds of elements have to be in there.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we refrained from defining scholarly podcasts. We deliberately grappled with the idea of, does a scholar have to do a scholarly pod? Does it have to be made by a scholar? And I think you can kind of assume that many of them are, of course, but in this definition, we can even start to interrogate who is a scholar, who can create knowledge, and who can be the peer. So the peer reviews in our model, or our sort of theorizing of what a scholarly podcast is, the peers can be the community, it can be lay people, it can be your colleagues, it can be other people in your discipline, it can be, but the fact that podcasts are public changes our view of expertise and peers, which I think is great, because there is a certain part of me that kind of wants to blow up academia and change it. So this is one way that we're kind of subverting the sort of norms, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and your
Like
book
what
gets
Hannah
into
would have
that.
called the fuckeries of the book, the key
Right.
fuckers. I'm
Right.
sorry if
And
I can't say that here, you'll have to edit it out, but
we'll get into that.
okay.
And then, so I definitely think we can kind of understand how an interview or like a conversational podcast uh, could fit, that academics would be drawn to doing that, talking to other experts or having conversation. Are there other forms? I mean, I know you have a podcast on academic or scholarly podcasts. So are there other forms that you've come across that are options that people who are maybe podcast curious, want to make a podcast could think about as
Pod
different
curious.
formats? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think that you'll find or I have found that a lot of scholarly podcasts take on the monocast or chatcast or interview-based approach.
Hmm.
So, for example, there is a podcast. I'm going to forget the name, so I'm just checking my notes here. Uh, I didn't even write it down. I don't think I did. Okay. It's a podcast by a woman who is a neuroscientist, and she covers what's new in the world of neuroscience.
Hmm.
And she does it as she introduces it with by talking about herself a little bit. One of the episodes I listened to, she said, "Oh, I just want to tell you why I've been a little, I've been away for a little bit, and it's because, in my career, this is what's happened. I've taken on this new role." And so she talks really authentically about personal and professional stuff going on. Then she identifies three key takeaways from the paper or the interview that she's going to do this week. So it's like a quick identification of what it is you're going to learn, and then she goes into the details. So she does that in monocast style, and I think she also does interviews as well. Monocast is not for the faint of heart because, of course, you're carrying the weight of the flow of the storyline on your own. But some people are very, very good at that. Dan Carlin, for example, he does hardcore
Hmm.
history,
Yeah.
which is like quite a popular podcast, which I would classify as a scholarly podcast.
Yeah.
I think, some of his episodes are over 2 hours long, and it's just
Yeah.
him, talking. But I think the chat cast really, or the interview based, and I mean they're kind of conflated in a way. It's people talking, it's people having conversation, and I think this is where we find a really great opportunity for what I might call like working your scholarship out out loud and together through conversation. And people who have taken part in this kind of scholarly knowledge creation or peer review, using podcasts as peer review, have often commented how productive it is because in conversation, you can have meaningful discussion. You can say, wait, what did you mean by that? Sorry, can you explain that thing? You can talk to the scholar about like, well, what did you mean when how did you get to that conclusion from here? And new ideas are generated always. I always find when I've participated in something like this that the scholar goes, oh, I hadn't thought of that. That's great. I'm going to look into incorporating that. And it never feels like the scholar is being told by an anonymous nasty reviewer number two, you idiot, like no one ever writes that, but the tone is there, or you can read
Mhm.
that
Oh
tone
yeah.
into it,
Yes, it's
right?
in the subtext
Into it.
screaming sometimes.
And
Yeah.
when you're talking face to face with people, you are engaged and what's the word I'm looking for? You're sort of you want them to succeed somehow. Like it just makes it a more caring, appreciative style of review or knowledge creation when you're talking to people directly, and you can work things out loud and together.
Mm, yeah.
Sorry, did that answer your question? I sort of kind
Yes,
of got rolling there.
absolutely. Oh yeah, it's made me think of so many things. Like first of all, I always think about what are we innately wired to do and what is more challenging, and reading, that we are not innately wired to read. And I think that is part of what makes reading so respected, and especially if you want to get through very dense ideas. I think in a lot of ways nothing beats reading because you can stop and slow down and look up words, read it over, ponder it. But since we are wired for conversation, and so I do think that we can just tune into a conversation and we'll be exposed to so many more ideas, so many more disciplines. Like as you were talking about scholarly podcasts, I was thinking, the Huberman Lab, that's like in the top three podcasts, I think, in popularity. And I know there's the psychology podcast. I think it's Brian Kaufman who does that. I think Brene Brown, who comes out of social work. So there's these people that have become massive celebrities and they're doing these scholarly podcasts. Now, not everyone's going to be pulling the Huberman numbers,
Yeah.
but I do think, I have a real interest in neuroscience, but that's something where I don't have to take time out of my own research and film studies or whatever I'm doing, and I can listen to a conversation. And another thing that I wanted to get to later, but let's talk about it now, is I've also make a point in my most recent book and in a most recent conference presentation, I've cited podcasts in those works because I'm always coming across like these brilliant distillations and brilliant lines. In fact, in this presentation I just did a couple of weeks ago, I played a conversation, an audio clip of Mark Maron in conversation with Alan Alda. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to this aspect of bringing podcasts into the fold of the sort of the academic way of doing things by not only saying that we need to reconfigure peer review and look at the ways that incorporating podcasts could improve peer review. And I want to talk a bit more about that. But also, can you talk a little bit about, you talk about it in the book, about how we actually cite podcasts?
Yeah, so in one of the I've noticed in Google when I'm doing various searches for my research that when it says people also often ask, and
Mm-hmm.
one of the questions that comes up is, can you cite a podcast in a research paper? So there's that, that question lingers, is a podcast a quote unquote legitimate form of academic output? And the answer to that is is maybe. I feel absolutely 100% that the knowledge and scholarship that is being conveyed and created through podcasting is, undoubtedly scholarly in nature and legitimate and credible and all the rest of it. I mean, there's questions around how that's evaluated, but we can talk about that. But 100% it's credible academic information. And so citing becomes a little bit more challenging because it's an audio-based medium, and it's hard to scan for what you can't really
Yeah.
scan audio, which is why it becomes really important for podcasters to provide transcripts for a number of reasons. One of them being that people could scan through to find what they're interested in, but also the accessibility issue around deaf and hard of hearing people. Um, uh, and I just lost my train of thought. We were
Well,
talking.
you're just talking about, I mean, I know that, for example, in my book, when I cited, it might have also been Mark Maron, but when I cited the podcast, I had to play it, listen to it, play it over and over and over to write it down. So definitely publishing transcripts is important to that. And I'm assuming most transcripts, especially because podcasting is a democratization of, what formerly would have been CBC radio or some kind of, private radio. And that's what allows academics to sort of kind of come into it. And is there an issue with generating an AI transcript? Because there is a labor intensive aspect that if you're going to publish a transcript that is actually really well done, that you're actually going to have to get, at this point, you're going to have to get a human to go through and fix it up? Or is it kind of acceptable to have that AI transcript available with this understanding that if you're going to cite it, you're maybe you're going to pay attention to if some word doesn't make sense, that you listen to the audio again and make sure that you have it correct.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the irony here is I'm sort of touting podcasts as one of the things about traditional scholarship is that we've always privileged the written word, as you were talking about before. And of course, as you said, we're not necessarily hardwired for reading, and I don't think we're quite hardwired for writing. Certainly not everybody is.
Mhm.
And I know that if we try to move away, or not away, this isn't, hey, podcasts should replace traditional scholarship or the written word. Not at all. It's complementary too. It just opens up, it allows things to be more accessible. But I guess the irony is talking about, okay, you need to provide a written transcript of the podcast in order to, to deal with it more conveniently, easily within an academic context. I mean, it would be really nice, and some of my colleagues and I have been discussing this idea of, could we conceive of a platform that allows for really simple citations of a podcast for researchers and scholars that are looking to podcasts for information. And the flip side of that is, how do we make the information that is within a podcast, um, how do we cite that information? So is there an expectation that we say, if we're talking about X theory, that we, stop and give a full citation? No, we don't, because we prize the conversational aspect, and we can do those citations in show notes or something like that. But it's a very good question, because there isn't a sort of standardized answer to how this could work. We thought about, coming up, blue skying, what would a platform look like that would allow us to do that? And then we thought, that's kind of like, that's more technical than we want to go in this book. So it's still up in the air.
It's interesting though, because I think citations are kind of a native to journal articles and books, and it works a lot better that way. And from our conversation with Kathleen Goldhar yesterday, one thing she said that's really important when academics go on to podcasts is that you have to break this habit of giving credit and referencing everybody whose idea informs yours, because your audience, you will lose them. And that's difficult, because we don't want to be taking credit, or we want to do that sort of academic generous thing to pay homage to the people with the great ideas. But that's really interesting, that citation, maybe when there's follow-up like readings, or this is what we mentioned in the podcast, that's a great way to cite. But in the flow of a conversation, it's a way that maybe the scholarly is being crammed into a medium, and it doesn't really belong there.
Well, that's just it. We want to think about, whenever we use any medium, new or old, for scholarship, we think about the affordances of the characteristics of that medium and the
Hmm.
affordances that it provides, and we want to leverage those. And one of the affordances, as you say, of podcasting is voice and conversation. And if we're wired for anything as humans, I think it's stories and
Hmm.
storytelling. I
Yeah.
always joke with my students, whatever you learned in science class about, the percentage of water in your body, it's something like 70%. I'm like, no, just forget that. It's 70% storytelling is what we
Hmm.
have in our bodies. This is how humans connect with each other, how they learn, how they
Hmm.
remember, how they pass down traditions, etc. So storytelling is huge. It's a huge aspect of podcasting. And so, yeah, you don't want stopping and citing constantly. You lose the thread of the story that you're telling. Now, of course, critics will say, well, this kind of begs the question. Scholarship needs to be precise, and
Hmm. Yeah.
it does need to be cited, and due credit given. But I think what we lose in using podcasting as one method of scholarly inquiry, i.e., the precision, we gain in other ways. So, having a conversation with someone about their research allows a personification of the research, and that's one of the issues I have with traditional academic publishing. Is you're supposed to depersonalize, depersonify everything about the
Hmm.
research.
Yeah.
And I think as we've we realize though that we can't, if we're going to deal with academic positionality, right? The lens through which we may not even be aware of the lens through which we are evaluating or creating information as scholars ourselves, right? Like, that's a lot of internal work. So some scholars working in certain areas will recognize that you can't decontextualize uh, information and knowledge from its source, and from the positionality of the researcher. And in fact, this is a very colonial way of viewing knowledge, that it is this thing that is created in isolation by a brilliant mind, and it is released to the world when it's perfect, when it's bulletproof and irrefutable, and there you go, and it's done, it's completed. In reality, knowledge creation is not like that. It doesn't come out perfect the first time. It's never finished. And I think that this is kind of what podcasting can allow us to think that, okay, this kind of messy, imprecision, discursive, collaborative, imperfect way of approaching something is okay to have in academia. And that can be very scary for some folks. Like, for example, if you're on tenure track,
Mhm.
you don't want to appear vulnerable in front of an audience, right? You don't want to
Yes.
have this conversation where anything could happen. And Kim, the conversation we're even having right now, like, it's gone off in different directions as
Mhm.
conversation does. We started off with a kind of, here's a list of questions that we're probably going to touch on, but we've kind of gone off in all directions in unexpected ways, and that can be really terrifying for
Mhm.
a new academic or a tenured, or rather a precariously employed academic who, the expectation is that you're bulletproof, you know everything, and you're never wrong. So, but what I think we gain through inviting that into academia, inviting that vulnerability and that understanding that knowledge doesn't come out perfect, and that we aren't perfect, and that it I think we gain a lot from that, and we gain new insights into. I feel like anyone who's participated in this kind of conversation has come out of it saying, I never would have reached that point had I just been, working in my ivory tower alone, you know, uh,
Mhm.
typing up a paper. And I think academia has privileged individualism. Even
Mhm.
when papers are co-written, I feel that the authors need to come to a consensus in order to put it in the paper. There's no sort of back and forth because you've depersonalized it. You can't say, oh, well, Lori thought this about that, and Kim thought this. And this is a really interesting conversation around
Mm.
contrasting approaches, but we can't have that conversation in this paper because it's supposed to be locked down and bulletproof and finished, right? And depersonalized. So yeah,
Yeah, that
I lost where we started with the
so,
question. That's
so
kind of
it make a lot of what you've been saying reminds me of so this is co-sponsored by the Humanities Research Group is doing this series, and we had an amazing talk in September by Randy Boyagoda, and he put forward this concept thinking out loud together and what a conversation needs to be. And he talked about how when you're thinking in your head, like, you are weighing different things and you are open to different points of, like, you're kind of trying to figure out how you feel about something. But then so often when we have a conversation, you're sort of you're entrenched in your position and you want people to agree with you. But if we hold on to our points of view a little less firmly and just have more of a sense that we do when we're thinking, that is, like, this is what I'm thinking, and you're open like that, I think is a brilliant concept. I think it's very needed right now in
yes,
academia and in the greater culture. And I think that, like, from what you're saying, like, podcasting is a medium where that can be modeled and where we can see that happen. Because of course, nobody wants to listen to a podcast where everyone's agreeing. You want different ideas coming into contact with each other, and that's where it gets interesting.
yeah, and I think there's always a certain amount of the pedagogical in podcasting, certainly in scholarly podcasting, where what you're saying is it's a model for others, um, of how knowledge can be created. Maybe for our younger colleagues who are starting off on their early career, professors or researchers, that the models they've been indoctrinated into aren't the only way to do things, and
Mhm.
that we don't always have to perform authority, that we can be ourselves, we can be human and come to greater expertise through that collaboration.
It's interesting because I think when it comes to something like a shirk grant or those kinds of things, depending on the committee, they always have different personalities, but a lot of times what committee members will be interested in is, has there been public outreach? And so podcasting is a great way to show that you are not just sort of hunkering down with your ideas and keeping them in sort of more elite circles, but you're actually, and I think that's so valuable because, and I think both are important. And that's the other thing is it doesn't have to be an either or. So we don't need to
Yes.
have these tribal fights about it. But it's interesting because I think your book addresses the like, and you were just talking about the stresses in getting a permanent job or getting a tenured position and all of those kinds of things. I don't see that, whereas I see that in shirk assessments. I don't see this so much in hiring because I think that podcasts would probably be considered very akin to like a popular media, like basically you wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail, those kinds of popular things where you're writing to the general public, and that would never really, that's a separate category that's almost like a bonus or something that might be like a
A
sugar on
little
top.
add-on. Mhm.
Yeah, but it would never get you there. So can we let's talk a little bit about like what you're hoping, like how podcasts will be seen and maybe given more legitimacy in academia as in terms of being respected as a contributor, a scholarly contributor, whether that's to get a job or just in general.
Right. Yeah. And you make a very good point. I mean, I'm not advocating to, just podcast and then go
Hmm.
apply for your, tenure track position. They'll love it. It really, at this point, it's becoming more and more accepted. So that is what I'm seeing over the past 10 years. We went from, I mean, I remember when academics were blogging, and blogging is very similar to podcasting, different in many ways, but it was a quick,
Hmm.
easy way for scholars and academics to form community, to share ideas and get feedback through the digital platform and web 2.0 technologies. And I
Hmm.
just remember hearing explicitly like people saying, like looking at year-end reviews and saying, oh, I write this blog where I publish every week, and they just go, a blog, just, and just the snobbery and that's not the way we do academia.
Hmm.
And this would inevitably be coming from, an old white dude
older
who,
older academics.
the
Yeah.
privileged person who came through academia unscathed and, it's just like, well, I didn't do that. And that's,
Hmm.
anyway, I
Yeah.
find that we are moving away from that. And we also, it's incumbent upon those of us who want to use alternate ways of disseminating and peer reviewing scholarship to tell our own story, to tell that story. What is it about podcasting that is legitimate and credible and useful to to furthering our knowledge? So one of the things that I try to do is, if I'm on a podcast, if I produce a podcast, I list every single episode of the podcast as a separate entity in my, report or on my CV. So it's not just
Hmm.
like one line
Right.
that says, oh, I've been producing this podcast for the last 6 years. It's every single
Hmm.
episode, right? And
Mm.
so that
Yeah.
you see the titles, you can see what the engagement around, like what it was engaging with, the ideas. And we just have to kind of keep pushing our administrators. And there is a very strong group of people, especially in the humanities, who, in Australia, they have something called, it's official, the NTRO, the non-traditional research output. And that can include a lot of things, including podcasts. And, I think a lot of the pushback comes from like, well, where's the rigor in podcasting? Like anyone can do it. You can just publish it. Where's the rigor? But it's something that is sort of designated as an NTRO in Australia actually has to go through more review processes than a
Hmm.
standard written thing. So there can be rigor. We can impose our own rigor on the work that we do, which is what we kind of have to do at this point, because academia has not quite figured out the what are the holes that we can squish this into? What are the boxes we can tick off? Like, we understand how that is done with written work because it's been around for so long. We understand that. And I think the
Hmm.
hesitancy to recognize podcasting is a legitimate form. It's just that we don't have the structures around it yet. We haven't squished it into any boxes. Some of us who podcast don't necessarily want academia to find the boxes into which it should be squished. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
Like,
Yeah,
because maybe that will take all the fun and insurgency and irreverence
right.
out of podcasting. But at the same time, I understand that there is a need for the academy to understand what we do and why we do it and what the impact of it is. And it hasn't quite sorted that out yet.
Yeah, I mean, this is all part of the anything called public. So, I do historical film, so that's public history. And then, so within the discipline, there's always historians who are really open to it, but then there's also those that sneer at like anything public. It's sort of beneath them. So I feel like this podcasting, the approach is really kind of on the side of all sort of all public facing academic work. So anything that looks to how ideas reach the public and has an interest in that, podcasting is just fits in there beautifully. So we understand how to deal with it. But then of course, it does go onto a team that can be somewhat beleaguered because of this sort of snootiness on the behalf of some people. And again, I think we should be able to all get along as long as the public historians or the podcasters aren't seeking to invalidate you hardly have any, did 30 people read your peer-reviewed essay? As long as that, you just have to respect should go both ways because it's an ecosystem in academia. And I think they're both really vital because if the public never has access to these ideas, it's almost like if a tree falls in the forest and it doesn't make a sound and yet, of course, if it was only the public facing, then that would degrade potentially the depth of what we're drawing on. So it's an ecosystem that can be mutually beneficial. And with that, I want to turn to what you talk about in the book about peer review.
Mhm.
So, and I'm just going to encapsulate in the book you lay out, and it's really great to see this sort of critique of peer review as it stands, that it can be too slow. I can't think of anybody pushing back on that. It can, in that we see when the paper was submitted and when it was accepted, although I will say that can be problematic as well because sometimes it seems like, oh, well, this author must have had to do multiple revisions. And sometimes absolutely not. They just got the revisions back after 18 months, so it can be too slow. It can be exploitative of labor because of the labor that it takes to do it, which is, unpaid labor. It can be mean. I love that you put this forward. It makes me think, I remember watching like a reality show like many years ago, and there was this like mafia wife or something, and she claimed she'd never had her heart broken. And I think she was saying that to prove like how desirable she was, that no one ever broke her heart. And my thought was, either you haven't put yourself out there at all, or you're lying. I suspect she was lying. And it's the same way. If you haven't had a mean, like a truly nasty, like schoolyard bully critique of your work, I would say either you haven't really put your work out very much or you're lying. So and you talk about the anonymity of peer review and that often it provides a cover for people to veer away from like looking at the work and actually engage some ad hominem attacks or insulting of intelligence and those kinds of things. So that is like definitely a really nasty and unnecessary part of peer review as it stands. And also that it's so hierarchical and it's all about boundary keeping and those kinds of things. I mean, the other reason somebody might not get a nasty peer review is maybe because they have such a brand name. I don't know, but there's this hierarchical aspect as well. So can you speak to this sort of way that you're trying to put forward podcasting as a way to break down these very, I think, inarguably negative aspects of the peer review process?
Right, right. You've painted such a great picture of
Oh, it's
of
very
what.
useful too, but
Oh,
these are the problems.
yeah,
Yeah,
and it's not
yeah,
that everything is broken, but those are
yeah,
some
yeah, yeah,
glaring, legitimate,
yeah,
problems
yeah,
with the
yeah.
way we do it. And I also think too, I want to point out that, if you're a scholar of any kind of marginalized identity, those nasty reviews can confirm in your mind that you don't belong here. You know what I
I
mean?
think for
Like
anyone, honestly, I mean, especially if you don't have, if you're newer and you haven't had a lot of accolades, yeah, it could
any
absolutely
new
destroy you.
scholar,
Yeah.
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 But I think there's a certain resilience in people who, yeah, I mean, anybody who, if you're thinking already that you don't belong here, if you're thinking you've got
Mhm.
imposter syndrome because the academy has always privileged, white male viewpoints. I mean, just look at the canon in any discipline, just about, right? Like who is all that written by and the historical, makeup of the academy and the academe in general. That can be really damaging to someone and possibly squeeze them right out. Like forget it.
Mhm.
I don't need to take this shit. I'm out of here. I'm going to go do
Mhm.
something else. So that's a pretty significant problem as well. But yeah, so with all of those things in mind, I think that podcasting, it creates, if you're using podcasting in a scholarly environment, it changes that environment to one in which the performance of absolute authority by an authoritative voice, there's a voice in written stuff, um, that absolute authority is kind of diminished in favor of characteristics that we associate with podcasting. So intimacy, authenticity,
Mhm.
personality, inclusion, conversation, open-endedness. So I think it just really changes our idea of what scholarship can be. So it's like moving away from the insistence on decontextualized, depersonalized scholarship. It's a monologue, the way that text-based publishing is. It's like it's just one person, or it can be a few people, but it's like we're done here. This is what we have to say. There it is. We're done. It changes the monologue to a dialogue, which is so important in my view in scholarship and especially in the humanities, but across all disciplines. I think that this recontextualized, rehumanized dialogue is we're collaborating through voice, through our voices, which are embodied, and that can have its own set of problems. I mean, one of the things that we uphold as the gold standard in peer review is the anonymization, right? But as we've identified, it can result in cruelty, um, uh, etc. So there is a vulnerability in putting your voice out there. We have all kinds of enculturated ideas about whose voice is authoritative sounding, quote unquote, and whose isn't. But maybe by hearing more voices that are embodied and that emote and enthuse and speak to each other in human ways, that we can expand our knowledge of who an academic or a scholar or a legitimate, credible person in this field can be. Um, yeah, and so we argue in the book that using podcasting to create knowledge into peer review, specifically peer reviewing, that it results in a more appreciative style of peer review. So, you talked about the sort of cruel off the cuff, one sentence, one paragraph written stuff that gets sent. If you and I were reviewing, if you were reviewing my work right now and we were talking about it, I mean, you it wouldn't be
Mhm.
possible for us to do that, right? I mean, you wouldn't look me in the face and go, blah, 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 and I don't want to talk about it anymore, right? But that's kind
Mhm.
of the written feedback is a closed circuit. You get it, and that's it. You have to respond to it, whether you understand what they meant or not, or whether what they said was even legitimate or not. We find in traditional publishing that editors are so overwhelmed that they don't necessarily take the time to interpret or refine the feedback for. So
Mhm.
it's just like, here it is, act on it. And, maybe some of it isn't even actionable because it just doesn't even make any sense. Um,
Mhm.
so, yeah, I think that podcasting changes, like everyone who's I keep saying this, but everyone who's participated in any kind of review through a conversation on a podcast has always said that was so productive. I have come out so much further in my understanding of how I can improve my work than I would have if I'd waited 6 months to get a few paragraphs from an anonymous reviewer.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah.
So, okay, so that peer, so, okay, so this is something I was missing. So that peer review of a podcast is done in a podcasty type format. So the peer review of a podcast would be happening kind of like what we're doing right now, face to face in conversation.
It
Is
can
that the
be.
way?
It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be. It can be done in more traditional ways. So, for example, Secret Feminist Agenda, Hannah McGregor's podcast, I believe, I could be wrong on this, but I believe the reviewers wrote their feedback. So it doesn't have to be
Mhm.
on a podcast, but it can be. Um,
You could
so
almost you could also have peer review as a podcast episode, right? Is that something you guys have looked at?
100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
I did a sort of proof of concept project called Open Peer Review Podcast. It's at oprpodcast.ca. And in it, I model how a peer review can be done on a podcast. So what I did was I had written a draft paper. And so this is conceiving of peer review as being potentially part of the process towards traditional publication, although it
Hmm.
doesn't have to be. Like the podcast itself could be the thing. Here's the scholarly output, the podcast in which we're reviewing this draft. So I wrote a draft of the paper. I invited a colleague, Dario Linares, to be the peer reviewer, and I invited someone from my university's like knowledge mobilization unit to be the host. They were both given summaries of the research ahead of time. The host was given some suggested questions to keep the conversation moving along. And in the podcast itself, I gave a summary of the research. Dario was invited to ask me questions, to interrogate my methodology, to ask me to explain some of the results and how I got there. And it was just like such a such a satisfying way to do a review. So you can do that on a podcast. There's another example. I mean, we have a bunch of case studies in our book of scholarly podcasting and how peer review is done for them. But I can talk about a few examples. So back in 2014, a scholar called Ted Rieken did he did what I might call like an audio paper. He took a walk in the woods while he extemporaneously talked about what was it he was talking about, like how multimedia, I forget exactly what the premise
Hmm.
of it was, but he did this recording. We can hear the birds singing, we can hear the rustling of the leaves and the branches. So it was a very contextualized conversation, or not even a conversation. It was him kind of thinking out loud. And it was submitted to a journal and published as an audio piece. And it was peer reviewed by the same method. So the reviewers, the three of them, got together around a table and had a roundtable discussion about what had been discussed in this audio recording. And they talked about the pros and cons of you can't anonymize a voice, so this peer review is like, we know who this person is, and so on and so
Hmm.
forth. But it was a really engaged conversation. So that's something we would call like a media adaptive peer review, where the review is done either in this very same medium that the work itself was put out in. But media adaptive can also simply mean what I was referring to in terms of Secret Feminist Agenda, where the questions that the reviewers are being asked to respond to are specific to the medium in which the work is being done.
So I just have a couple more questions for you, and I wanted to let people know who are in the audience. If you have questions, you can either put them in the Q&A by text. So if you just go to the bottom of your screen, there's a question mark in a comment bubble. You can click on that and submit a question. And also, if you'd like to come on the screen and ask your question on the screen, we'll share the screen with you, and just raise your hand, and Alyssa, who's hosting from behind the scenes, will bring you on. So if you have any questions, any at all, in terms of you're interested in doing a podcast, how to make it scholarly, any questions at all, please give them to us. So, in the last couple of questions, you brought up the emotive, the intimacy aspect of it. And I think that's something we should be really thinking about because that's what a lot of sort of emotion studies and scholarship has shown us. That I think before, where there was this sense that there's the emotion and the rational mind, and that this is absolutely not how our minds work at all. And in fact, how our brains work is we have an emotional response, and then what our brain is wired to do is to make sense of that emotional response and sort of see the truth in it. So it's not our rational minds. It's kind of, I think there's a metaphor of like a rider on an elephant, and the elephant is the emotion, and that's really the one running the show. So it's a way that we can be kind of, if if we're going to be empirical, then we do want to do work that is open to the emotional side of things, because you're right, like a lot of academic work has all been to try to like put that down and just seem super rational. And so in a way, what you're doing is kind of withholding the emotional that has more of a venue in podcasting to be kind of, and it fits there.
Yeah. And that's kind of on the continuum of what I was talking about earlier in terms of decolonizing knowledge. This is a very colonial attitude. It's very Eurocentric, this idea that we can separate those aspects of our brains and our personalities and be completely objective. Even like I think of Jane Goodall, and she was excoriated by other researchers in her field for naming the chimps because heaven forbid, you can't anthropomorphize, and yet her approach just opened up, it's inarguable that her approach and her work opened up like so much more knowledge about what she was studying. So by kind of questioning the norms of academia, and understanding what we've been trained to think of as appropriate is maybe not necessarily going to get us where we need to go. And so looking at models of relationality from indigenous worldviews, where we are connected to each other and the land and everything around us, and knowledge isn't this like separate thing that just occurs out of thin air, and to recognize our positionalities and everything we bring to the table as people, that all of that impacts on our research and how we interpret it. And so to recognize that as opposed to pretend it doesn't exist, I think is really important.
Yeah, and it seems to fit in with sort of the oral histories and or the oral tradition, right? So it's just an expansion into a new media of that oral storytelling that is so important, but that gets a bit shunted aside in academia.
Yeah.
So, okay, a couple of other things I want to ask you about. Have you thought about using this made in Canada concept that has different names in different places, but in Canada called research creation? So thinking of podcasting as a form of research creation, is that something that you've thought about for podcasting?
For sure. And it is research creation. I mean, bottom
Mhm.
line, 100% it's research creation. And it can be used, podcasting can be used as a data collection method, for example, whereby, the traditional interview is done within the context of it being thought of as a podcast. And there have been academics who've proposed methods of using podcasts as primary data, like how to approach that. So whether it's someone else's podcast or you are recording it yourself and turning it into a podcast, it can be data collection, it can be data analysis. So it can
Mhm.
be you and colleagues getting together to discuss data and pick it apart and turn it over and chew it up and play volleyball with it amongst yourselves and come to new understandings of it. So I mean, I think in every way that counts, podcasting is research creation. Yeah.
And finally, so you in the book you talk about that new structures in academia should emerge that support this new medium. Can you just touch on what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Like, what are the structures? I'm sort of, I'm of two minds. I
Hmm.
don't know whether I want to be part of formalizing those structures so that I can
Hmm.
have some input into them, or if I
Hmm.
just want to be like you know what, if you need to formalize these structures, knock yourself out. Because there's part of me that doesn't want it to be formalized, doesn't want it to be, and there's part of me that recognizes that it kind of has to be for many people to want to engage with it, because you're not going to roll the dice on your tenure application by,
Mhm.
if podcasting is seen as an extra add-on, something that's nice to do, and people on your tenure committee are not going to recognize it as full scholarship, then you're just not going to roll that dice, right? So I don't know what the structures could be. To be quite
Yeah.
honest, I have no idea. I'm hoping someone will, or many people might take kind of what we've laid out in our book and run with it. Just, scholarship is an ongoing conversation, and so it's
Mhm.
this book is complete, but the scholarship is not done. And I hope that we can figure that out together. People who are interested in this, maybe we can come up with a structure before academia imposes one on us. Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is part of an ongoing debate. Tomorrow's session with Carlo Charles is about art-based dissemination. He's a sociologist, but I think this happens in all arts-based academic programs, where a lot of times, for example, as you see new arts-based PhDs emerging, and what they will often ask you to do is write a dissertation of the same length as a normal academic dissertation, and then on top of it, do a full arts-based practice.
Yeah.
And so that's,
Uh-huh.
yeah. So I think that there's a common cause, like I said, with this idea of public dissemination. But then, so I feel like it would be maybe easier to give credibility, which I think would be important. I understand what you're saying. You don't want to have all these strictures and telling people how to do it, but it would be great to see an acceptance of the value of disseminating to the public. But then I do think that I mean, and that would be a benefit. That would be to not have it be just an add-on, but to actually be it's a legitimate sort of uh, different sort of secondary, or not to put it in a hierarchy that way, but a legitimate outlet for your work. But then can we see our way to a place where you don't have to also have published the articles, published the book, or but but maybe it could. I mean, certainly if you're like in your field, I think that's an easier thing to push for. If you're working in media, you're working in audio content creation, to create a podcast as research creation, as a creative work. I suspect the bigger difficulty would be you're working in other humanities fields or social sciences, and this is how you want to disseminate your work. That would probably be stickier.
Yeah, maybe. Although I think that, if you're working in, if you're doing ethnographic research, podcasting is
Hmm.
really sort of obvious
Hmm.
medium in which to conduct that research. Autoethnography, of course. I mean, there's various approaches to scholarship that I think are um, really amenable, or podcasting is a really amenable medium for that. And I think it's incumbent upon us not to think of podcasting as the dissemination part alone, because I
Hmm.
think that dissemination of research, while it's spoken of as being very important, as you've pointed out, it's kind of also thought of like the secondary thing, like the add-on. Okay, you've done the research, tick the box, fantastic. Make sure it gets out there, make sure it gets
Hmm.
out there somehow. But nobody's really worried about that, as you say, because we don't necessarily in the academy value public public facing work. And so I think
Hmm.
that um, podcasting can be very community accountable. So if you're doing research on any kind of community and that to whom you need to be accountable, podcasting is a great way to do that. And it isn't just the way that we, you know, give it out to the public, I think, as well. It is scholarship in and of itself, and it is also a way that it is conveyed to the public. But I also think the podcasts that are doing one thing will sound very different from the other, because there are all kinds of, knowledge mobilization units that are like, we need to do a podcast and we're going to interview, researchers that are doing interesting work at our university, and so we'll put it out there just to show people, hey, look at how great we are here at this university and what we're doing. And I think that's different than taking the approach of I'm going to be creating some knowledge here, or I'm going to be peer reviewing some knowledge here in the podcast format. I think those are kind of they're related but different.
Yeah, it's a good point because whereas in text, most times you're translating, whereas with a podcast, you can very often literally just present your data. So that it's the work that you've done in the field is right there. So that is something to for a lot of scholars in a different format, right? That not the interview format necessarily, or maybe you're interviewing the subjects, but they're right there.
Yeah,
And
and then
yeah.
you capture everything about how they're saying it. That's long been an issue in oral history and that sort of thing, where how do you capture the ways in which they've emphasized certain words, or the nonverbal cues that they're giving. How do you annotate that in a transcript, and how does the reader of that interpret that and understand that? So that it's like it's already gone through two translations before it gets to the reader. Let's just make it more direct. It's really simple, right?
Yeah. Well, I really do recommend the book for anybody that's interested in podcasting and also interested just more generally in what academia does and how it can like not be stuck in the 20th century and like stay very contemporary and modern. And I also love that I think I mentioned that the sort of the tone that we can often have in podcasts where it can be humorous and more relatable, that's captured in the tone of the book, which is great because you're sort of moving the written form and sort of infusing it with the spirit of podcasting as well.
Thank you for that. I'm delighted, and yeah, thanks for the compliments.
Yeah, and before we go, if do you have any podcasts you want to point the audience to or projects that you're working on that you want people to just have on their radar?
Sure, yeah. I've got another book coming out and should be out in February, that I've co-edited with Dario Linares. It's called Podcast Studies, Practice into Theory. And so the idea is that, as a somewhat emergent medium, I mean, I know it's been around for 20 years now, but the study of it is still coalescing. And I think we're making great strides in that. But we've attempted to bring together various perspectives on what podcast studies is. And we've done that by inviting people, scholars who podcast, to theorize their practice. So the idea is that it's a flip of the traditional textbook, theory into practice that everybody loves. It's practice into theory. So we've been doing this. We've been using it as part of our
Mhm.
scholarship. We've been, not because it ticks any boxes at the academy, but because we've really enjoyed it. And so, what is that? What have we learned from our experience in practicing? And I think that's it's interesting because that's a little different than, say, like a film studies scholar, for example. They don't necessarily have experience making films. I mean, they can
Mhm.
and they
Mhm.
could, but filmmaking is this kind of big sort of almost gate kept. It's difficult for the DIYer, but podcasting is
Mhm.
different. And so many people who are podcast studies scholars also podcast. So I think that makes it quite a unique perspective and experience. So anyway, that's podcast studies theory into practice into theory. And I'll also point out a couple of podcasts. So for example, there is a podcast by Amber Sewell, who is a librarian at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She was very excited about the model that I proposed in the uh, open peer review podcast, that she got in touch with me and asked me, can she reproduce this on her own podcast? So she's just put out an episode where she invited me to be the host. Hannah McGregor was her peer reviewer, and we reviewed a draft paper that she had done. And she's also put out the call that if anyone else wants to have a draft of their paper reviewed in the same way on that
Mhm.
podcast. So yeah, so those are just a couple of things that are going on that I wanted to draw your attention to. Thanks for asking.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us. I think you make a very strong case for podcasting. And I mean, it can be daunting because there are millions of podcasts out there. So you have to know kind of what you're getting into, but it's an exciting field. And I mean, I don't even know if I know anyone who doesn't listen to podcasts. Maybe there's a bit of a generational divide between TikTok and podcasts, but generally the people in my generation and just above and just below, that everyone listens to a podcast. So whether you want to create one or you want to listen to one, I think that academia has to grapple with it. So thanks for telling us about all the work you've been doing.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, take care.
Bye.